Roy Linzee Tutill was born in 1954 in Surrey, England. He grew up in the county of Surrey, a stretch of gently rolling countryside south of London, a world of green hills, wooded valleys, and quiet English villages that had changed little in their essential character for generations. Surrey in the 1950s was one of those places that sat close enough to London to feel its energy and far enough away to keep its own pace. Commuter villages and market towns were scattered across it, places of church halls and village greens and cricket pitches where families lived in solid houses on leafy lanes and children cycled to school and knew every shortcut through the fields. Roy grew up in one such village. He lived with his parents, Dennis and Hilary Tutill, and his siblings, including an older brother named Colin, at a house called Wheelwright's Cottage on Wheeler's Lane in the village of Brockham. Brockham was a small, picturesque settlement in the valley of the River Mole, 1 mile south of the famous Surrey beauty spot of Box Hill. It had a village green, a church, and the unhurried quality of a place where nothing much happened and where that was entirely the point. Roy was known to his friends and family by the nickname Tuts. He was 14 years old, a pupil at Kingston Grammar School, a selective boys' school in Kingston upon Thames, approximately 16.5 miles from Brockham. Every school day, Roy made that journey. He was described by those who knew him as a quiet, studious boy, diligent at school, well-liked, thoughtful. Outside of his studies, he had two particular passions. He loved cycling, and he loved model aircraft, a hobby he shared with his brother Colin, the two of them building and collecting together in the way that brothers do. He was saving his money toward buying a new bicycle. Every spare penny he could put aside went toward that goal. One of the ways Roy saved money on his daily commute was by hitchhiking part of the way home from school rather than paying for a full bus ticket. From Kingston Grammar School to Brockham was a journey of around 16.5 miles. Roy would take the bus part of the way and then, to save on fare, he would get off and thumb a lift for the rest of the route. It was something he did regularly. His parents knew about it. It was, in the Surrey of 1968, an ordinary enough thing for a schoolboy to do. The roads were familiar. The area was known to him. He had done it many times before without incident. Surrey in 1968 was a county in the full swing of the 1960s. The decade had brought change to every corner of British life. New music, new fashions, new freedoms, a loosening of the social certainties that had held since the war. For the families of Surrey, life had become more comfortable than it had been a generation earlier. Cars were more common. Television was in most homes. Children who had grown up in the austerity of the post-war years were now teenagers in a Britain that felt genuinely different from the one their parents had known. The idea that everyday life, walking to school, catching a bus, thumbing a lift home, carried any particular danger was not something that most families in a quiet Surrey village thought about in 1968. On the afternoon of Tuesday, the 23rd of April, 1968, Roy Tutill left Kingston Grammar School at 3:30 in the afternoon. He was dressed in his school uniform, the distinctive Kingston Grammar pink blazer with grey stripes. He joined his friends on the bus heading south. After approximately 4 miles, at the stop near the White Hart Public House in the area of Hook, Roy got off the bus. He had his bus ticket in his pocket, a 6-penny fare. He stood at the roadside and began trying to thumb a lift for the remaining distance home to Brockham. He was seen by a bus driver who stopped briefly at the Bridge Road roundabout nearby. The bus driver noticed a school-aged boy speaking to the driver of a car parked in the bus bay. A light-colored vehicle, described variously by witnesses as a silver grey or white car, consistent with an Austin Westminster saloon. The driver of the car was described as a short, stocky man with whitish grey hair, leaning across the front of his vehicle and talking to the boy. Then the car drove away. Roy Tutill was not seen again. That evening, when Roy failed to arrive home at Wheelwright's cottage, his parents Dennis and Hilary notified Surrey police that their son was missing. Officers began making inquiries. Photographs of Roy were taken to the area around Chessington and to nearby locations. Bus drivers were questioned to see whether they remembered seeing the boy. The pillboxes near Brockham were searched in case Roy had taken shelter somewhere. The following day, further inquiries were made. There was no sign of him. On Friday, the 26th of April, 3 days after Roy had last been seen, forestry workers found the body of a boy in a wooded plantation at a place called Small Beach Copse, in the grounds of Cherkley Court, near the village of Mickleham, in the Surrey countryside. The body was partially covered by a school blazer. It was Roy Tutill. He was 14 years old. A post-mortem examination confirmed that he had been strangled with a rope ligature. He had also been sexually assaulted. He'd been driven to a quiet spot between Chessington and the surrounding countryside, where his killer had attacked him before strangling him and leaving his body in the woods. Surrey police launched a major investigation. The witness account of the bus driver, describing the silver grey or white car and the short, stocky man with whitish grey hair, became the central focus of the inquiry. Police identified the car as being consistent with an Austin Westminster saloon and began the task of tracing every owner of such a vehicle in the United Kingdom. In the days before computers, every record had to be searched by hand and maintained on a card index system. 18,000 drivers of Austin Westminsters were traced and interviewed across the country. Over 1 million car registration documents were examined by Surrey police. It was an effort of extraordinary scale for the era, sustained entirely by manual record keeping and the work of officers going door to door. Police also staged a reconstruction of Roy's last known movements, driving the route he would have taken and appealing to the public for anyone who might remember seeing a schoolboy in a pink-striped blazer on that afternoon to come forward. Appeals ran in national newspapers. The case attracted wide public attention. Despite all of it, no suspect was identified. The investigation ran on, and eventually ran cold. Dennis and Hilary Tutill were left to live with the death of their son. Dennis died in 1970, just 2 years after Roy was killed, never having seen any resolution to the case. Hilary, Roy's mother, never fully recovered from the death of her child. She died in 1996, also without ever knowing who had killed her son. Roy's brother Colin and his sister both eventually emigrated, Colin to the United States. The family had been broken apart by what had happened on that April afternoon in 1968. The investigation was periodically reviewed in the years that followed. In 1998, Detective Superintendent Brian Woodfield reviewed the case, hopeful that advances in forensic science might produce the breakthrough that had eluded investigators for 30 years. In 2000, Detective Superintendent Cook took another careful look at the evidence. Crucially, a partial DNA profile had been recovered from a sperm stain on Roy's clothing, a sample that had been carefully preserved since the original investigation. By 2000, the technology existed to build on that profile and compare it against the national DNA database. The question was whether the person responsible had ever had their DNA taken. In September 1999, more than 30 years after Roy Tutill was murdered, a man named Brian Lunn Field was stopped by police in Birmingham and arrested for drink driving. As was routine at the time, a DNA swab was taken from him and entered into the national database. In 2000, a match was returned. The DNA taken from Brian Lunn Field at that routine drink driving arrest matched the DNA profile recovered from Roy Tutill's clothing. It was a perfect match. Surrey police began building their case. They set up surveillance on Field, who by then was living quietly in a flat on a housing estate in Solihull near Birmingham, working as a gardener and not paying taxes. They discovered who they were dealing with. Brian Lunn Field had been born in 1937 and had been living in Thames Ditton, Surrey, near the route Roy took home from school, at the time of the murder in 1968. He had left Surrey shortly after the killing and had spent subsequent decades moving around Britain for work, living below the radar. His criminal record, as investigators assembled it, told a consistent and deeply troubling story. In 1969, he had been fined for gross indecency. In the 1970s, he was convicted in Aberdeen, Scotland, of an offence against a 14-year-old boy and sentenced to 2 years imprisonment. During the 1980s, he received 2 separate 4-year prison sentences for offences involving teenage boys, including unlawfully detaining 2 of them. His record showed a pattern of targeting vulnerable young people over many years, long after Roy Tutill's disappearance. The original case, however, remained unsolved. On the 21st of February 2001, Surrey police arrested Brian Lunn Field during an early morning operation at his flat in Birmingham. He was taken into custody for questioning. Field denied ever knowing Roy Tutill or having any involvement in his disappearance. He acknowledged his previous convictions, but claimed that part of his life was behind him. Investigators continued their inquiries and, as part of the investigation, requested a formal DNA sample. The following morning, Brian Lunn Field admitted responsibility for Roy Tutill's death. He told detectives that on the afternoon of the 23rd of April, 1968, he had offered Roy a lift after seeing him by the roadside. He drove the boy to an isolated location where a serious offence took place before Roy's life was taken. He then left the scene and drove away. Earlier that same day, he had been visiting his wife and their newborn baby in hospital. Brian Lunn Field was charged with the murder of Roy Tutill and stood trial at the Old Bailey in London. He was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. At the time of his conviction in 2001, Roy Tutill's case was recognised as the oldest cold case to be solved in the United Kingdom, having remained unsolved for 33 years. That record stood until another historic conviction was secured in 2012 for a case dating back to 1966. Field's first wife had been unaware of his involvement in Roy Tutill's death. Years later, her sister, Catherine Roots, spoke publicly about the lasting impact of the case on her family. She described the deep distress it had caused over the years, and said that Brian Lunn Field's actions had left a permanent mark on all those connected to him. Hello everyone, thank you for listening and drop any feedback below. I would love to hear your thoughts and hope to see you again right here on Cold Case UK.